The latest meeting of NATO defence ministers has just started. It goes on this afternoon, this evening and tomorrow. What is significant about this meeting, which after all is a regular meeting of defence ministers taking place normally 2 or 3 times every year? Well, first, there is, of course, a new US Defence Secretary, somewhat surprisingly, Mark Esper, who has only been in office in the Pentagon for a week after his predecessor, Patrick Shanahan, resigned. And therefore, he comes straight into a very important international meeting in Brussels. So it's a good chance for him to familiarise himself with NATO, his now fellow defence ministers, and to get a sense, of course, of what views are like on some big issues from the European side of the Atlantic, particularly as NATO, coming out of its 70th anniversary just last April, marked in Washington, now has to prepare for the next big meeting, which is a summit of all of NATO's leaders in London in December. But apart from the agree to meet, the handshaking with the new US Acting Defence Secretary, I think there are going to be 4 big substantive issues which will dominate the meeting. Number 1, Iran. Everybody, of course, has been following the tense situation in the Gulf with the US having accused Iran in recent weeks of putting mines on oil tankers and trying to impede shipping in the Straits of Hormuz. US has deployed an aircraft carrier and 1,000 extra forces, number of ships, number of aircraft in the area. Tensions have been high, even though President Trump just a few days ago revealed that at the last minute he had cancelled a series of US airstrikes against Iranian targets in the wake of Iran shooting down an unarmed US drone. There have also been reports that President Trump and the US administration did not consult the European allies ahead of those planned airstrikes. And of course, when you look at the fact that the UK, France and Germany were all part of the group of countries with the United States, including the European Union, that negotiated the Iranian nuclear deal and have been together with the United States, of course, in Iraq, have been together in the anti-ISIL coalition in Syria, I think that the Europeans will really be wanting to use this meeting now with the United States new Secretary of Defense to make the pitch that they should be consulted. They have a big interest also in the Gulf, and it's best if the US continues to act as part of a broader coalition rather than alone. I don't think that there's going to be any particular outcome on Iran. I don't think, obviously, that the European countries will make an automatic pledge to support the US in military action. It will depend largely, of course, on the circumstances. President Trump has been offering to negotiate with Iran, although the Iranians have objected to that. I think everybody will be looking for de-escalation for a peaceful outcome to that. The Europeans will be having also a separate meeting today to see to what degree the nuclear deal can still be continued, even without the US, but it will be important, I think, for NATO allies, even if NATO itself is not directly involved in the Iranian dossier, but for the NATO allies to establish an effective transatlantic dialogue in Iran, because clearly this is going to be an international crisis point for some weeks to come. So that's issue number 1. Issue number 2, INF Treaty. The last meeting of NATO foreign ministers back in December announced that Russia would have 6 months until the INF Treaty, the Intermediate Nuclear Forces in Europe Treaty, expires on the 2nd of August. So that's not tomorrow, but this will be the last meeting of NATO defence ministers before that 2nd of August date arrives. And frankly, to my mind at the moment, it doesn't look at all likely that Russia is going to heed the summons from NATO and cancel the deployment of a new illegal Russian intermediate range missile, which NATO calls the SSC-8, and come back into compliance with the treaty. So anticipating that outcome, I think that what's going to happen at the NATO meeting is that the defence ministers will have a discussion on what do they do next if Russia doesn't comply and continues continues with the deployments, which directly threaten, for the first time in the last many years, 30 years plus, European cities, European strategic targets. The Secretary General of NATO, Jens Stoltenberg, on behalf of the Allies, has ruled out any new NATO land deployments of nuclear weapons, but NATO will not be able to sit on its hands and do nothing at this major breach of a treaty, which changes the nuclear balance and the security situation in Europe. I don't know if they'll announce any new countermeasures at the meeting. I don't think so. I think this is still premature. NATO's military plans are looking at what NATO can do. There is talk about more nuclear consultations, more exercises, more ships or aircraft from the United States temporarily visiting European bases. But the package of measures that NATO will need to take, short-term, medium-term, long-term, will need to be discussed and set in train, with the prospect of something more concrete being announced at the NATO summit in December. This will be a sensitive issue, but if Russia does not comply, an unavoidable issue for the alliance in terms of upholding effective defence and deterrence in Europe. Issue number 3, unsurprisingly, it's always on the agenda these days: burden sharing and defence spending. I don't need to tell you, the viewers of this video, about President Trump's strong pressure on the Allies to meet their commitment that they made back in Wales in 2014 to spend 2% of their GDP on defence. This always comes up. Yeah, on the one hand, there's some good news from NATO. In 2014, when that decision was taken, only 3 allies were spending 2% of their GDP. Today it's 8, and according to NATO statistics, the number should be around 16 to 18, half the allies, a little bit more, by the target date to achieve this goal of 2024. Indeed, there is also more good news. 22 allies are now increasing defence spending. The rise this year has been 3.9%. So President Trump, his message is being heeded by the allies. But you know, half of the alliance is not all of the alliance. Some countries, Spain, Luxembourg, are still under 1%, let alone being close to 2% of GDP. There is always a lot of American pressure on Germany as being a country of particular significance in this regard. You can see the glass full or the glass as being half empty. What happened back in Washington a few weeks ago when President Trump welcomed all of the allies to Washington, foreign minister level, to mark the 70th anniversary, is that President Trump started to look upon this as a good news story, putting the emphasis on the increases rather than the gaps. And I think at this defence ministers meeting, NATO will be very keen to maintain this semblance of transatlantic unity on spending, to emphasise the positive rather than the negative, and not have another difficult summit with President Trump on burden sharing, such as NATO experienced in Brussels back in 2017 and last year in 2018. Finally, if you're still listening and if you're still watching, space. Because one of the really interesting and new things from these meetings of defence ministers will be that NATO will finally adopt a space policy and a space strategy. Long overdue, in my view, when you consider that NATO adopted a cyber policy already back in 2002 and has been working on this issue for a long time, and when you consider that space has been an area of military competition and a very congested environment for some years now already. But it's a case with NATO that it may sometimes be late in coming into a new domain, but when the NATO bureaucracy creaks into action, things happen very fast, and I would anticipate on this basis that at the meeting of NATO leaders in December, they will announce, like they did for cyber back in Warsaw in 2016, that they are now recognising seeing space as a domain of military operations, with all of the implications for NATO planning, capability development, force requirements, and all of the rest. You have to remember that more and more communications, more and more meteorological activities, more and more NATO weapon systems are directly guided and fired from space. Who dominates space will very much dominate 21st century European conflict. 58 countries in the world now have satellites. India was the latest in the game by launching recently an anti-satellite weapon, and NATO countries own 65% of all of the 17,000 odd satellites in space. So NATO really has skin in this game, it has skin in space, and therefore adopting a strategy which is really opening the door for NATO planners to take a closer look at what NATO's vulnerabilities are in space and where the capability gaps are is really the first stage. And as I said, this is long overdue, and I welcome the fact that the Rubicon on space will now be crossed here in Brussels this afternoon. That's all. Thank you very much for watching.